master demands. But yeah, you kind of brought up one of the initial points I wanted to riff on, which is that you were long interested in them from an early age. So was I. And it's not just us. Like Gnosticism, quote unquote, is all over the internet. And I think it probably has to be from the Matrix, right? At least from a modern standpoint, because the Matrix really takes all the tropes of Gnosticism, this idea of living in a false world, there's this malevolent creator, and you can wake up in the quote unquote simulation or the false reality and escape and initiate yourself into the light of whatever the true reality is, the real reality. And though, as we're going to cover, pinning down exactly what Gnosticism actually is pretty impossible to do, and it's a really problematic term in and of itself when you really dig into it. But that is one of the broad themes. Again, this idea that we live in essentially like either a simulated or false or problematic reality, and that if you get the right wisdom or know the right secrets or do the right practices, you can escape from this false reality. And I think Absolutely. That's what really appeals to people.
Yeah, break the veil. I mean, it's a very mystic philosophy 101, if you will, in terms of, even kind of the Islamic mystics, the Sufis. They have a lot of poetry around this world being temporary and kind of returning back to the beloved. Certainly the Hindus, just like Gnosticism, there's no Hinduism proper either. But you have the Advaitins, in particular, Advaita Vedanta, which is extremely, the world is an illusion. We're here to crack through it, see through its transitory nature. And, it's the Gnostic kind of core theme, to your point, does excite me because it does share overlap with all these other mystic traditions. And even, as I read about in my book, Plato's Cave,
Absolutely.
Kind of the most famous image of your boy is this idea, the shadows that are just on the wall, and the true reality is up above.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe to just place it in context for people who are, I think there's probably quite a few people watching that sort of what we just described, that might exhaust their actual knowledge of what this is. And they might be like, yeah, that's kind of what I thought. That's what it is. But where it sits historically, at least roughly speaking, is like the first couple of centuries AD, Common Era. But it's very much like these ideas, to your point, are very much in a lineage. And to me, it becomes much more interesting when you see them in their context of being influenced by Platonic thought. Like you mentioned, the Plato's Cave is one. These really interesting emanatory metaphysical pictures painted by people like Basilides and in the Apocrypha of John, which we'll probably get into both of those more deeply. But also like Hermeticism too, man. Like there's a lot of ideas that are really indistinguishable from Hermeticism. But then what makes it unique, like there's a number of things, and again, I'm really generalizing, but again, is this idea of a purposefully malevolent or deceptive creator. And of course, the curveball of like, what is Jesus in all of this? Because these are Christian groups, right? But they have like these weird esoteric interpretations of Jesus and like what his role is in all of this.
And extremely varied as well.
Yeah, right.
Even within the Gnostic teachers.
Yeah. So at this point, maybe let's get into who they are, like who some of these more well-known Gnostics are, and what kind of books they were reading, and then we should definitely get into the Nag Hammadi library, because that shit is so interesting.
Yeah, sure. I mean, essentially, we didn't know a ton about them for a couple millennia. What we have had over the last 2,000 years is the letters and the correspondence and writings of early church fathers, most notably Irenaeus, Hippolytus. They were essentially called heresiologists.
Yeah, right.
Which is the Bible scholarship term for Gnostic haters, basically. Yeah. And so what we knew about the Gnostics primarily, the vast majority of what we knew, I should say, before 1945, teaser, was all from Christian writers like Irenaeus, who basically, from just an objective standpoint, that's not a great source. If what you're learning about a group is from the greatest antagonist of that group, that's certainly going to paint an unfair picture of their beliefs. And I want to even read a piece where I think even Saint Jerome, despite immense theological difficulties and differences with Basilides, still complements his capacity. There's an interesting nuance about those relationships, but
cool.
But yeah, it starts very early. Marcion, I'd say, and kind of in terms of the teachers, the big four Gnostic teachers, is kind of a nice way to start to break down what the heck this means. Are Marcion, Valentinus, Basilides or Basilides, and Mani. Marcion is 2nd century, and he's the earliest, essentially. Marcion actually puts together the first canon of the New Testament. And the first compilation of Gospels is put together by a Gnostic.
Right.
To say these are the books. This is the authoritative view. And then eventually Irenaeus kind of makes what is essentially the corrective canon to Marcion's earlier canon. But that's how early this guy is. I mean, that's how early these different variations of interpretations are. When you move in further into the 2nd century, then you get into Valentinus and Basilides, and then Mani is 3rd century, who actually that becomes Manichaeism, which influences a variety of other even Middle Eastern religions, and it flavors even Zoroastrianism and Buddhism and Hinduism in some way eventually. We'll come back to this, but even St. Augustine, or St. Augustine of Hippo, my buddy who proposed original sin, right? Augustine was even a Manichaean for a time.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, and he sort of got his whole Hellenistic upbringing, or his whole Hellenistic education, and he says weirdly
in a Gnostic school.
Right. And it says weirdly a lot of complimentary things about Plato, and almost goes as far as to say, like, man, if I would have read Plato at the wrong time, I might have just been a Platonist. He kind of says something along those lines.
And what does survive in Augustine is a lot of his, a lot of what you and I were talking about before about the beautiful names for God, about like the sourceless source. And the incomprehensible and kind of the unnameable one, the ineffable type of language, that apathetic language. Augustine, that survives in his kind of post-Gnostic Christian theology. So it's influential. These guys are influential.
One of the really just quick sidebar things that I think is so ironic about Augustine is that he himself is such an intellectual and so highly educated, and was such a rigorous thinker, yet he's sort of arguing that you don't really need any of that. Like you just need to have faith, and you need to follow the teachings, essentially, that, we, the actual, the ones who know the real Christianity, essentially, as long as you follow these teachings, you're fine. Like the advent of Jesus as the Savior has made it so you don't need to worry about any of that stuff. Like you just trust us on this. I mean, I'm totally.
Augustine is. No, you're right. Augustine is where we get baptize the baby immediately.
Yeah.
So it won't go to hell.
Right. Yeah.
That's from him.
Yeah. The mixture of ideas is wild. But anyway, I wanted to ask you before we get too far away from the origins of this, who is the one, is it Simon Magus who claims to have been a student of Paul directly? Because there's one of the early teachers that claims direct lineage from Paul, and then that's disputed hugely by the mainstream Christians, but
well,
maybe we should look this up.
Marcion is very Pauline.
Okay.
And what Marcion pulls from Paul as a Gnostic teacher is Paul's very frequent juxtapositions of the God of the law and the God of salvation. And that is a heavy theme in Paul. And so Marcion actually considers himself, despite being Gnostic, as within the Pauline lineage. Whether or not he claims to have directly studied under him, I'm not sure, to answer your question. But
Gotcha.
That's what makes Marcion unique among the Gnostic teachers. And, maybe before we get in too much further into like Marcion versus kind of Basilides and Valentinus and then later Mani, like even just zooming out on like, what is Gnostic? What is that word? We kind of said this earlier, but like the whole idea around we don't belong here. We're strangers in a strange land. The idea of the word gnosis means knowledge, and it means a kind of transcendental spiritual knowledge that comes from a higher level of intuitive embodiment that is restorative in some way in our true identity with the one, with the source of the source. And it plays well with the mystic traditions. It plays well with some of the Eastern traditions as well. And that's why I like it a lot. It also you and I were talking about this earlier too. Gnostikos is the Greek word from which it comes, and which is referenced by Plato. That word comes from his era in terms of explaining, essentially distinguishing knowledge between practical knowledge, like building a house, preparing food, etc. That's a practical knowledge, versus Gnostikos, which is an ethical knowledge, which is a self-transformational knowledge.
Yeah, and it also, I think I do think that what I brought up before we were recording is kind of an interesting parallel between the propositional and non-propositional kind of knowing. I think that fits in there too, like this idea that like propositional knowing is kind of what it sounds like. You have a bunch of logical propositions, like you're looking at a sentential logic formula or like a book of directions or something like that, versus knowing, embodying, doing, learning through participating. Like that's a totally different way of knowing. And it's being, right? Like it's a kind of knowing that requires
reading about the taste of an orange,
Right. Absolutely. So yeah, it is important to cover that for sure. And by the way, so Simon Magus was first century and is in several biblical texts apparently. So I need to revisit that. I won't.
You want to close the loop.
So now we're getting into these weird schools that. And I want to revisit this thing about heresiology, because one, it's just such a badass, like sort of way to be known of. Like the only way these figures were known of was through highly coordinated bashing by the people in power. And the fact that we only knew that these, at some point, really influential groups existed is because of how heavily they were derided with a lot of vitriol in certain cases, like to a point where I don't remember if it's Irenaeus or who it was, but some of them literally go as far as to say, like, this is literally Satan. Like Satan literally got into these early church groups and like just spat poison in their ears. And
they called like Marcion the mark of the beast. I mean,
right. And
firstborn of Satan.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. That's a direct quote?
That's a direct quote of Irenaeus, who considered Marcion the firstborn of Satan, yes.
And I don't know, people listening, I don't know if you're like me and probably Bob on this respect, but as soon as you say that about a person, I'm like, tell me more. I want to know more. Because
what did they write?
yeah, because to me, that is the most childish form of trying to control someone's mind, right? Try to scare them away from this idea as evil because, if you play with this idea, I can't help you. This is the devil now. And as soon as I hear that, I know that there's something that's hitting a nerve with the people in power. And to me, it's really obvious. Like the difference, again, between these groups and the groups that end up winning out as mainstream, what's the major difference? You having an experience for yourself, finding the truth for yourself through this kind of non-propositional direct knowing versus being told, being saved, being, helped by this apparatus of the powerful, right? It's very much like a sort of esoteric kind of like libertarian spirituality versus a monolithic
village.
Yeah.
Don't go out past the trees, boy.
Right.
It's very fear-based, and it's because let's start with Marcion for a little bit. He's really fascinating to me. What he's basically doing is flipping the entire theology. And I write about this in my book, Original Sin is a Lie, out now, where essentially what Marcion did was he said, the Old Testament God sounds different than this loving Father that Jesus is talking about. And that's true. I mean, you can compare the perspectives and the personification of, what essentially in some areas, the Old Testament is also very diverse. That's a whole other episode. But, there's instances where the God of the Old Testament essentially encourages ethnocide. Yep. He encourages the killing of babies in some parts. He's a jealous God, is one of the quotes in Exodus, which is a pretty egoic thing to say, and personified, etc., anthropomorphized. Whereas the Father that Jesus talks about is his love falls on all, just like the rain on the just and the unjust. Jesus is very often characterizing this unconditional love of Creator, and that's really that's one of the main differences between the Gnostic teachers and the Orthodox Christian teachers, is that the Orthodox Christian teachers are reconciling these differences, and that's become kind of what the modern world considers as like Christian apologetics, right? Christian apologists are the ones that are putting all the pieces together. I make the joke that it's like the Charlie meme. Stunning. It's always something just
conspiratorial.
Like it all connects.
I'll flash this up on the screen.
Whereas, I think there's a lot of legitimacy to saying, well, wait a second, what Jesus is talking about, is this God of love and oneness and unity, as opposed to this, war, God of war, essentially, God of kind of conquest. What Marcion does is he strips away all of the Jewish elements of the Gospel of Luke, which is the sole gospel in Marcion's canon, and anything really good about the ancient Jewish tradition and the law within Paul's letters. So he basically publishes an abridged version of Luke. I'm not a Marcionite, although I have been called a Gnostic on TikTok. Marcion essentially only uses abridged Luke and Paul biblical narratives as the kind of foundational text for his teaching. This makes Marcion unique and a good kind of first person to talk about, aside from the more extensive mythology Gnostic teachers, because there's no extra biblical mythology in Marcion. It's purely Paul and abridged Luke. And so, what he's doing is he's flipping just a couple of more pieces about him. He's basically saying, he does say that Jesus's body was a phantasm, which is docetic.
Yeah, we gotta talk about this term, because this is something that blew my mind. That this is like So remember, this isn't people trying to explain away Christianity. This is people who
these are Christians.
Yeah.
This idea that Jesus was essentially not inhabiting a earthly body.
Yeah.
Because again, the earthly body is created from the false god. It's it's impure essentially, and so Jesus as this redeemer, as this transcendental figure, actually didn't even inhabit a body. So his death was an image of a death. He also believed, unlike Basilides, that Jesus did die on the cross. So there's like all these like distinctions.
Right.
Like he's a phantasm, and he did die on the cross. Unlike Basilides, who says he was an image, but he didn't die on the cross. He was substituted.
So if you look this word up, it's this idea that he was not a literal he existed in some real way, but was not a human. Like he wasn't actually a human. He was some kind of like logos,
kind of avatar
or
figure,
nous, like divine mind, basically, that came here to do like some kind of redemptive act. Yeah. So you can see, like, this is one of these things, like, just I find so interesting, is that there are all of these monolithic ideas that everybody today who calls themselves Christian, largely, I mean, obviously there are Gnostics out there who go hard into these like texts and really think that these texts that we found in Nag Hammadi are telling some version of metaphysical truth. And we'll get more into detail about what these metaphysical truths, in air quotes, could be, or claim to be based on these texts. But yeah, so one, it's super interesting just how diverse the thought was early on. And two, like to me, even as like, I don't know what I call myself, by the way, but even to me, it feels like really, this is a big idea, like this Docetism idea, or am I saying the word right?
Docetism, D-O-C-E-T.
Docetist, this Docetist idea. It seemed like a piece of nuclear material to bring up to any Christian these days.
It's fascinating. And I mean, it's in the text, and kind of, Gnosticism is considered the oldest and most threatening enemy to Christianity. I mean, I guess the devil, it's like Gnosticism is called the oldest heresy. It's very easy for contemporary Christians to dismiss something as being Gnostic and therefore irrelevant. And, I think what a lot of the modern scholarship and modern textual analyses, modern archaeological discoveries all indicate is that there's a lot more legitimacy in terms of how early these guys are. Some people said, like, this guy one time asked me, like, well, what do you think of Irenaeus's interpretation? Irenaeus isn't the master. Like, to me, I'm interested in Jesus's teaching in terms of my own spiritual practice. I believe Jesus was an enlightened man, an awakened man. I believe he was a Buddha, right? I believe he was someone who broke the veil. All of these later kind of political arguments is lesser men that are not on that level, and they're making their own kind of interpretations in schools. I'm not sure if I gave you this image last time, so I apologize if it's a repeat, but the image of the volcano is it's Brother David Steindl-Rast. He says all religions start from mysticism. It's like a volcano. You have an explosion of a volcano that is the initial human being that makes that divine connection and that kind of unity consciousness, that loving power that's tangible and jaw-dropping. And what happens is it explodes, the lava starts to roll down the mountain, and after a decade, a century, a millennia, it becomes cold, dead rock.
Right.
And I think that's a pretty damn good illustration of the kind of religious founders, many of whom didn't intend to found a group, etc. It becomes kind of watered down and diluted over time by these kind of egoic political schisms and so on. And, this is kind of another aside. I love how tangential our pod is. So we'll come back to closing out Marcion the rest of the teachers in Nag Hammadi in a minute, but the Gnostics, for example, drew lots to see who would lead the service, which is a fun fact, and it's kind of, it's also indicative of like why they didn't have lasting power, because they had this kind of
communal,
egalitarian view, whereas like the Orthodox Christians have this institutional, which is much better at self-preservation throughout the centuries.
Hierarchical, consolidates power, consolidates wealth,
right. So that doesn't mean it's better, because it's able to survive the centuries. It means it's more ruthless, in some ways.
True, 100%.
So just a couple more things on Marcion here. Despite his docetic strain, and this is, by the way, this is from Love Does Not Condemn, which is a really good Ken Wapnick book, who's in A Course in Miracles commentator, which I'm a big fan of. But he references a lot of different Gnostic scholars in this book on Platonism, Gnosticism, Christianity. So great book, Love Does Not Condemn. So some of this is from that. Marcion, despite his docetic strain, Marcion shared the Pauline view that Jesus redeemed us from the curse of the law. So he shares that with Paul, but he disagrees with Paul's ransom for sins, rather canceling out the false creator God's claim to us. So again, there's kind of this, Marcion has like Pauline flavor and then Gnostic flavor. This is a funny example too. Marcion did believe Jesus went to free the souls from the underworld after he was crucified, but only the characters condemned by the Old Testament God. So Cain, the Sodomites, not Abel, not Noah, not the ones that the OT God thumbs ups, but rather the ones that he condemns, because the OT God is a false creator God. And that's what infuriates, Irenaeus and the heresiologists, to say this is how backwards this guy is, that he's saying Jesus rescued Cain, not Abel. And then kind of lastly on him, he did actually, sometimes it's called like an anti-cosmic theology, like if the entire kind of material world is this false creation, then what that tends to do in a practical way is inspire asceticism. So the Marcionites were very much ascetics, fasting and renunciants, etc. And much of that actually did eventually flavor the 4th and 5th century Desert Fathers, who are beloved.
This is like the Essenes and
it starts with St. Anthony and Gregory. There's a couple, they're fantastic. The Desert Fathers they reject the kind of Roman institutionalized Christianity. They said there's too much emphasis on this thing becoming a state. Let's go out into the desert. And they kind of have their like Christ-like off into the desert kind of fasting energy. But some of that is flavored from Marcion's kind of ascetic anti-cosmic theology.
Super interesting. And again, you can see why, not very popular, right? Like way easier to just be like, how about we just do something like one day a week? How about we just follow these tenets and do these like brief rituals? That's way more common man republic friendly lifestyle than
so true.
I mean, then that, and this I think is both the strength and weakness of all kinds of mysticism, is that it's really there, and there's no, like, the strength is that it's there. All it really requires is that you withdraw from the senses, orient inward, and regularly do some version of that kind of a practice, or alter your mind with the right molecules or whatever, and you can experience something very strange, very mystical for yourself. The weakness is that no one wants to even do the work to achieve that, and it's not a popular thing to be like, yeah, just go live an ascetic lifestyle, just go fast, just go meditate, just go have a life-altering personal experience that causes you to question everything that you've been told. Like these are not super popular ideas, especially for people in power who are trying to preserve some semblance of monolithic control.
That's so true. Well said. It's very much, the conditioning, right? And the kind of domestication of man in terms of, kind of back to the Matrix and back to the, the idea of, maybe this is a good segue, right, into Basilides and Valentinus, the more sophisticated Gnostic theologian. So Marcion kind of stays within the realm of early Christian narrative. Later in the second century, basically the second half of the second century, we don't. Again, I'm student of Bible scholarship. Like you use the word enthusiast. That's pretty good. I don't have a PhD. I have a humble bachelor's, but so don't take any of this authoritatively. Basilides, we don't. I believe we do not have anything hardly at all that's original in terms of what his theology was. But what we do have is Irenaeus' summary of him and Hippolytus' summary of him. And they're actually even a little bit different, which just says a lot of things. It says, one, that they're not that good journalists. And two, it also says that Gnostic teachers have this tendency to kind of be a bit more malleable with their theological views, and perhaps even in evolution.
And just to interject too, another really interesting thing about Basilides that I think a lot of people watching will find interesting, considering
this fact.
Yeah, considering we talk so much about Jung, is Jung himself was not only interested in Basilides, he ascribed his mystical writings that he dubbed Seven Sermons to the Dead. He ascribed them to this thinker, Basilides of Alexandria, which I think I understand a bit better now than I used to, but I'm still somewhat perplexed by why he did this. I have a couple of different thoughts on why, but before we go into Jung and his interest in Gnosticism and Basilides, let's actually talk about Basilides and how he fits in and what, because all of his thinking is incredibly interesting to me, especially, again, as an enthusiast of not only Jung but Platonism. Like Basilides is like standing at the center of that cross, no pun intended. Like he is absolutely right there when it comes to both weird, cool, esoteric, Platonic metaphysics and Jung's mystical writings. So this is a super, for me, interesting figure, and probably the one that I'm the most fascinated by.
Yeah, he's really great. Irenaeus, I'm quoting from Love Does Not Condemn here, Irenaeus presents an essentially dualistic ontology of Basilides, which reflects the influence of Middle Platonism that is the following. The Basilidian system begins with the unbegotten Father, from whom emanate 6 pairs of spiritual powers. From the final pair, Sophia, wisdom, who's core character in Gnostic theology, and Dynamis, power, there come 365 heavenly powers, or aeons, to which correspond, of course, the worldly year. The last of these powers created the world, and their leader, the Jewish god, is actually called Abraxas. This name is derived from the numerical value of the number 365, since the Hebrew word for 4 is Arba. Abraxas may also have etymological roots with the tetragrammaton, the 4 consonants of God's name, YHWH, Yahweh. To free his children from the tyranny of Abraxas, who, quote, wished to subject the other nations to his own men, that is, to the Jews, end quote, the true creator God sent Christ, one of the original 6 emanations, into the world, manifesting himself in Jesus. In order to fool the world, Jesus, at the time of the crucifixion, substitutes his image for Simon of Cyrene and vice versa. Those who believe that the real Jesus suffered and died on Calvary were thus in error and worthy of Jesus's derisive laughter as he stood watching from a nearby tree. Scorsese.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So just to restate and also add additional context and color to everything Bob just described there.
Yeah.
So for this Gnostic mystic Basilides, his metaphysical hierarchy is very reminiscent of Middle Platonism. And what does that mean? So you said like from the unbegotten Father. He also uses this phrase, the sourceless source. And this is akin to the Platonic one, like the one, the good, the source which cannot be named, essentially. And whenever Basilides does talk about this sourceless source, it's all apophatic language. Like you can't, there's some fragment where it's that exists where he's talking about like what existed before creation, and it's all negative theology. Like it was nothing, but it wasn't nothing because it wasn't a thing and it wasn't nothing. It's like it's that kind of stuff where it's absolute mindfuck territory. And I love reading this stuff because it
sounds like Nagarjuna to any Buddhists out there.
It brings me into an altered state because there is, regardless of if there's any metaphysical truth or not, this kind of stuff always brings me into this almost weird visionary mind space where I start to feel a little bit high. Because there is a logic to it. Like there is it's also very Pythagorean. It's like Platonic and Pythagorean in the sense that there's this number mysticism attached to it.
Yeah.
And there's also another thing that's extremely Platonic about it is, so you have this sourceless source, then you have, and I might confuse this a little bit with the Apocrypha of John because they're similar but different. But then you get like this first pair. Right. And there's your Pythagorean triad right there. Right. They were obsessed with the Pythagorean triad, that there was the like transcendent one. And then there was essentially some kind of initial masculine feminine principle. And then when you have that triad, you start to get all other triads emanating from this triad. And in some Gnostic metaphysics, which I'm almost certain it's the Apocrypha of John on this one, that first principle is like both masculine and feminine in one creature, and then that thing splits apart to form the first triad. So it's always some version of this, like, and then from there you get these, and from what I understand, this is an exclusively Gnostic idea. You get these aeons, and these aeons are also like gods, but they're also kind of like Platonic images, or like Platonic forms, in that they really they represent some sort of transcendent quality. I believe, again, if I'm not confusing Basilides with the Apocrypha of John, there are like these 7 hypostases, and the 7 hypostases are like prudence and I'm forgetting a bunch of them, but then you eventually get to
psycho-emotional.
Yeah. They could also be viewed as like Jungian in that sense, like Jungian archetypes. But then you eventually get to Sophia/wisdom, and Sophia/wisdom always has some kind of interesting role to play in these weird esoteric metaphysical hierarchies. But yeah,
Sophia has a moment of envy of the one's ability to create.
Yes. And is this still Basilides now, or is this Apocrypha of John? Because I know that this is an Apocrypha of John, but I don't know if it's also in Basilides or not.
It's a good question. We should wrap up Basilides.
Before we go there. Agreed. So yeah, just to finish. So this is where the overlap with Jung becomes very interesting, because Jung was also very interested in this Abraxas character, which again is Basilides' idea for what the true god of this realm is.
Or the untrue god, but the creator of this world, right?
Yes. It's worth noting, one final note, is that these 365 realms or heavens or whatever we basically live in the lowest one. We live in like the bottom. We live in like the furthest one away from like the true source. And that's part of the reason that we can be deceived by this archon, God, aeon, whichever one it is in this ontology, that basically confuses us and makes us believe that we are living in, that it is the highest God, when in fact it's actually one of the lowest.
Yeah. The theme of ignorance and realization is a motif in Gnostic, in all Gnostic tradition, absolutely, and well put. This is Irenaeus writing about the Vasilitian Gnostics. Salvation is for their soul alone. The body is by nature corruptible. Basilides says that even the prophecies themselves came from the rulers who made the world, and that the law in particular came from their chief, him who led the people out of the land of Egypt. They despise things sacrificed to idols and think nothing of them. I should read it more antagonistically. But enjoy them without any anxiety at all. They also enjoy the other pagan festivals. They also engage in magic, conjuring of the dead, spells, calling up of spirits, and all the other occult practices. Not many either can know these doctrines, but 1 in 1,000 and 2 in 10,000. They say they are no longer Jews, but not yet Christians, and their secrets must not be uttered at all, but they must keep them concealed by silence.
Yeah. Isn't it funny how you could read that with a super excited tone or a super angry tone, and it would be
it sounds awesome to me.
It sounds pretty fucking awesome. And just to, again, add a little bit more color to that, these are a few more notes I took about Basilides.
Yeah.
Again, there's a whole episode of Secret History of Western Esotericism about it. Love it. Highly recommend it.
Shout out. He's a genius.
Yeah, I want to talk to him someday. But so, as Bob pointed out, again, so these are esoteric Christians, and according to this commentator, they're not even Christians. But what does that mean? So it means that, first of all, they have this hidden metaphysical hierarchy that is very key to their idea of salvation. Like if you don't know this, that you're in this low, essentially like lowest realm, you're not going to figure out how to become free. But also, they believe in reincarnation. He's a strong believer in astral fate, and he's a strong believer in what they call accretions. And he's one of the earliest examples of this idea of astral accretions. And what an astral accretion is I don't think it's fully known, like what their belief and how a human got a soul was. But in the Platonic, broadly Hellenistic, mystical lineage, the idea is that when you are incarnated and the fates basically join your soul to your physical body, it goes down through these planes of influence, which are like the planetary spheres. And as your soul goes down the planetary spheres, it accumulates these archetypal qualities. So you get all the Jupiterian, Mars/Aries, Venusian, Mercurial, all of these different aspects. And of course, that corresponds to astrology. So this is essentially a metaphysical picture of how the personality and the archetypes and the personality are arranged. And then this is also highly correlative to your personal fate. Like this web of interactions between the archetypal governing forces and the individual are essentially your astral fate and your personality and all of these different things. So that features heavily in Basilides' thought. And then this also brings up the interesting idea of how does one recognize this and again begin to escape this. But I don't think we know that specifically with him, though other thinkers have a lot of ideas on this. So now you can see why he's calling him a pagan and that he is like that they participate in pagan festivals, because they're still rolling all of these ideas into their thoughts. Like they're preserving this, adding new things, obviously. But yeah, they still believe in like the planetary powers. They still believe in like the other gods, but they're sort of in a different hierarchical context or something like that.
Right. And the Nag Hammadi library as we discussed earlier, contains Plato's Republic, for example, right? So the Gnostics were reading Hellenistic sources beyond Jewish and Christian texts.
Totally, yeah.
They were very open, and Nag Hammadi is not that far away from Alexandria, which was, had a decent library there, a cultural capital of the ancient world. And so, I think one of the real beauties of the Gnostics, despite their, I was telling a friend about them, like the fanfic stuff. Like I know that you're into respectfully, the kind of Platonic mythology, and it is very cool and interesting. I'm less into the mythology of it. I think the reason I'm more interested personally in the Gnostics is because they're challenging the orthodoxy, which is, I'm pro anti-establishment in that way. And they're also talking about this capacity of the gnosis to awaken from our ignorance, which in a lot of ways, it sounds just like the Upanishads, in some capacity. And we should get to Thomas as well today, which is, potentially even proto-Gnostic, because it could be that much earlier even than the Gnostic teachers. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a beautiful syncretic system that is open, and despite it not having that cohesion that the kind of monolithic orthodoxy has, it's open and much more appreciative of the larger human experience by way of all these different traditions. So honoring them for that.
Yeah, let's get to Nag Hammadi, but I do want to return to what I think is the importance of the metaphysical picture of these types of groups versus the metaphysical picture of popular religion, because I do think that there are some really important differences that to me actually have measurable quality of life kinds of sense-making implications. But I don't want to derail and go into that right now. So the way we know about a lot of this stuff, we've already alluded to this, is that there was this insane find that we
basically had an Indiana Jones movie take place in 1945. Yeah, the internet confirms Against Heresies by Irenaeus was the best surviving description of Gnostics until 1945. So, there was basically an Egyptian shepherd named Muhammad Ali who was digging for fertilizer near his home in 45 and found an earthenware jar which contained 53 codices, singular is codex. They're actually some of the earliest leather-bound books that we have in human civilization. We had a lot of scrolls in those days, but they started making essentially leather-bound books to be able to reference different scriptures more easily, etc. Because they were buried in Egypt in the desert, they survived, and it's revolutionary. It's one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. What is in these texts are essentially the Gnostic corpus. They're all of these different books that, Irenaeus and Hippolytus and others reference. And they say, this is this text called this. Hippolytus even quotes a verse from Gospel of Thomas, which lines up with the one we found. So there's a lot of kind of validating from our pre-existing material that we have on these guys. What are the texts themselves? There's a variety, and it's actually quite a variety.
Yeah.
We have the most famous is the Gospel of Thomas, which I'm happy to chat about with you. A few of the big ones are, as you were referencing, the Apocryphon of John, which is the secret book of John. That's where we get the cosmology. The Gospel of Truth, which is also similarly cosmological and quite good. and attributed to Valentinus. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Philip, which is another apostle, which is similarly radical in its elevation of Mary Magdalene as a significant disciple of Jesus. We have the reality of the rulers. I'm just reading the list here of some of the big ones. The Gospel of the Egyptians, the Apocalypse of Paul, the first Apocalypse of James, the Thunder Perfect Mind.
That sounds so like
pretty
Easter.
bad, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It sounds Tibetan.
Yeah, it does.
The Second Treatise of the Great Seth, the Tripartite Tractate, and as I mentioned, Plato's Republic. So that's a few of the big ones.
Wait, what is the tripartite?
So you kind of have like different genres within the Nag Hammadi library. You have like how the cosmos was created. You also have like dialogues. One is actually called Dialogue of the Savior. You have kind of conversations with Jesus, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You have others that are similar to the Gospels. So there's 3, 4, 5 different genres within these texts. It's such an incredible window into formative Christianity. Essentially, yeah. It's significant because, and let me be very precise about my dates here. The texts themselves are written in Coptic, which is an ancient Egyptian language. And they date these texts to be 4th century, so in the 300s CE, which is right around the time that Christianity becomes the state religion of Rome. Not so preposterous to think that there was some book burning going on for everything that wasn't authorized by the institutions. Yeah. And so, like I said, it's quite the Indiana Jones, monk running from troops, digging frantically and putting these things in there. I mean, that's probably what the hell happened. So you crazy old monk from the 4th century, we bow to you. Thank you for hiding these things, because we wouldn't have the Gospel of Thomas, unless this person did this. The reason we know, so these are Coptic versions of their 4th century, 300s texts, but they're, because Irenaeus, for example, is writing about several of them in the 2nd century, we know that they're the Coptic versions of Greek texts.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think even whenever sometimes I'll make videos on Gnostics on the internet, and I get comments of people saying, these are 4th century, they're irrelevant. It's like, these are the 4th century versions, guys. The sources for these versions are much earlier. And the really cool thing, too, to me about Thomas, there's a lot of cool things about Thomas, but Thomas might even be 1st century. So a lot of these texts, and Marcion 2nd century, Valentinus is late 2nd century, Basilides is late 2nd century. But
I think he's like mid.
They're mid, mid to late. I mean, they're early. They're earlier than a lot of the church.
Yeah.
But the Gospel of Thomas might even be 1st century, which there's a lot of, there's no scholarly consensus on the date of the Gospel of Thomas. There's passionate debate, frankly, around whether or not it's contemporary with the earliest Gospel, Mark, whether it's contemporary with Matthew and Luke, which are the middle Gospels, or if it's contemporary with John or later. And some crazy bastards even suggest that it might even predate Mark. I am as a student of Bible scholarship, I personally ascribe to the scholarly view that it was at least contemporary with Mark, potentially predates Mark, because of what it is.
A note on this, because I'm even less of a student than you are, but this stuff. Yeah, but what's really interesting to me is when you see some of the rationale for dating on things, or legitimacy of things. Like, for instance, there's a bunch of like Plato has a bunch of letters, and people believe that those letters were legitimate for a very long time. And then later scholarship, and I'm not saying this is wrong, by the way, later scholarship is like, no, almost all of these are phony, if not all. Like so like for the nerds out there, Plato's seventh letter is the one that's considered to be most likely to be legit. But then when you start looking into the rationale for the legitimacy, some of it seems pretty solid and some of it seems highly speculative. Like, oh, well, the tone in this one doesn't match the tone of that one. So it kind of doesn't make sense that if this one's legit, that this one would also be legit. It's sometimes it's that thin of reasoning, and sometimes it's linguistic. Sometimes it's like, oh, well, they wouldn't have been writing this way or using, and to me that's a little more solid but still iffy. And then there's like very solid, like this 100% contradicts this, and this also, there's other pieces of circumstantial evidence. So there's like a range of solid rationale to like educated guessing speculation, and you just get to this level where you are respected enough that your speculation matters a lot. But
scholars are doing their best.
It's not a lot of it. My point is only that a lot of it is not empirical. It's very
it's educated guessing.
Yeah, educated guessing. Based on the other evidence we have, we're guessing this. So yeah, interesting. But also kind of my countercultural rebellious take, I guess.
And that's so valid. And, maybe that's another conversation, but I could go into why, like, I've also even gotten in trouble with some friends and colleagues, like being critical of the world of academia in some ways because of the politicking involved in essentially, not wanting to come to light certain different, more radical hypotheses that
like the psychedelic hypothesis. That is one of those things that gets beat up, but it's
starting to get some momentum a little bit.
It is. Yeah. Maybe we can sidebar into that, but
So let me go. I'll give you a tight 3 to 5 on Thomas because it's my favorite. The Gospel of Thomas is so revolutionary because of a few facts. One, it is merely a list of sayings. It's 114 verses, and they all just say, Jesus said this. Jesus said this. So it's, when you look up any verse in Thomas, it says Thomas saying 70, Thomas saying 15. Which, from the argument of earliness, it's a pretty good argument that it's early if there's no narrative.
Right.
Even the Gospel of Mark, the first gospel, the scholarly consensus that Mark's the earliest, is a sophisticated narrative. It has symbolic plot points and, things that happen in this very... the gospel writers were no dummies. They were writing, pretty sophisticated pieces here. And the fact that Thomas is just like, it's almost like this guy just, scribbled it down really quickly, to say Jesus said this and Jesus said this, and without any consideration in really the order. Scholars kind of admit that there's no real structure to the sequence of the sayings. The first couple are pretty powerful and the last couple are pretty powerful, but, that's a good argument. Secondarily, should have got the percentage. I'm sorry. I want to say around 40% of the verses in Thomas share thematic overlap with the synoptics. When I say synoptic gospels, I mean Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the early 3 of the 4 in the Bible. And it has the greatest hits, basically. It has the mustard seed. It has the wedding garment. It has tell me what I'm like, which are, people familiar with the New Testament will be familiar with those. And again, what's crazy about Thomas is that when the verse in Thomas is simpler than the verse in the Bible, which, again, is another excellent argument for it being earlier, for the gospel writers having Thomas or having something similar to Thomas that they're then expanding on. I mean, you can literally read, you can Google Thomas right now, you can read it in half an hour. You can contemplate it your whole life,
and there are controversial elements to it too, right? Like you haven't touched on those yet. Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, I'm kind of going down the list here. One, just sayings collection. That's okay. Just sayings collection. Two, overlap with the New Testament, which are simpler and arguably more primitive, and therefore potentially earlier. Third, zero mention of the crucifixion and death and resurrection of Jesus, which is highly, highly, highly significant because of Christianity essentially being based on the quote-unquote blood ransom, right, of our sins. He died for our sins, and now we can all go to heaven as a core theological tenet of Christianity. And yet, this sayings gospel, this collection of sayings, doesn't give a damn about the death, resurrection, and crucifixion. So all those three things are really, really, really important about Thomas. I think, the other question is, what are the sayings that aren't in the New Testament, and what the heck do they say? They're very good. I can read a couple really quick if you don't mind.
And while you're looking that up, like isn't it funny that I assume that the lack of resurrection and crucifixion is a core reason it was excluded, but it's kind of funny because even a lack of a mention isn't necessarily a dispensation with that idea. Like it doesn't dispense with that idea, but just even the idea that it could is probably enough to get it removed,
Yeah, there's even so in John's gospel is where you have the doubting Thomas image.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is starting to get to the edge of my expertise here, admittedly, but there's a scholarly discussion around it's called like the Johannine community, means like the people around the Gospel of John, and then like the Thomasine community, the people around the Gospel of Thomas, that those communities were at odds with one another. And so therefore the Johannine gospel portrays the apostle Thomas in a negative light as the doubter who doesn't believe that Jesus is back. He vilifies Thomas while, Thomas isn't necessarily vilifying John, but the lack of an emphasis on a crucifixion would be a theological, impasse between those two communities.
But at the same time, if
it's ancient beef, baby.
It's also, if it's a book of sayings, like, why would it be in there? I don't think he was given like dropping, gems while he was being murdered. So it's like it could just be
He does say, mission. "Forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Okay,
which is bars.
It is bars.
I mean, that's unity consciousness at its peak to me.
Yeah,
that's absolutely. A good one.
Absolutely.
But just there's no event. The author didn't feel compelled to include. And by the way, this is how this is why he's important. No, the emphasis of Jesus's life and mission, or etc., is his ethical teaching. And it is very Gnostic, right? It's Jesus' Gospel of Thomas saying 70. Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." Very Gnostic.
Yeah.
This is a controversial one, saying 108. "He who will drink from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become he, and the things that are hidden will become revealed to him."
Yeah. And
equality, capacity. Yeah.
Yes. But also, when now that we're in this domain of pulling some from these forbidden texts, and we haven't talked specifically about things like the Apocrypha of John yet, but it would be mostly a repeat of some of the stuff we've already covered, but we totally can get into more detail on it. But if you view Jesus as a manifestation of divine mind, like logos or nous, and you read what you just said, what does that make you think? Versus the exoteric interpretation of Christianity, which is very literal, very like there is no spooky intrinsic quality that you have to become aware of. Like, this is all just like, believe this, do these things, and that's what you need to do. Versus if you take this notion that, again, is very syncretic and very much an echo of Hermeticism, Platonism, earlier schools of Western esotericism, to me, it's very clear what that's saying. What that's saying is, I am the divine mind. You have a share of the divine mind in you, but because you're human, you're prone to letting your lower appetites control you. You're prone to like letting what Plato would call the eros or the appetite run your life and not reach that higher faculty. But if you emulate this figure, you will become like this figure. And what is this figure? It is like the divine mind. It is the nous or the logos, depending on which flavor you like. And that's what he's saying. And I think that's why it's so controversial. And it was so suppressed, because if they're essentially just like restating what the like other Western esotericists were saying and the Platonists and Hermeticists were saying, then it's not really as monolithic of a religion as it seems to be. And that is not acceptable. Like, that is like the highest, most threatening thing, to say like, yeah, they all kind of get it in a different way and you can choose whichever you want. No. That is not what the monolithic dominator culture wants, to quote Terrace McKenna.
The cultural engineers.
Yeah.
Manufacturing the bones of a dying world. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's extremely distinct from exoteric institutional Christianity that, essentially says you are very separate from the one. The one receives our worship and our adoration, and you ain't him. And it takes it a step further. You're dirty, and you require this other person to enable your freedom,
right?
Salvation. Soterio is the Greek word for salvation. It means to be made well, which is very
different,
reasonable.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a lot more reasonable sounding. Would they use that word in the context of like other not spiritual things, like being healed, like just recovering from a disease or something like that? Do you know?
That's my understanding.
Interesting. Okay.
Fun side note, kind of on Greek verbiage, like, and pseudepigrapha. You're talking about forgeries of Plato. Well, forgeries of Paul is a huge. There is a scholarly consensus. There's an academic consensus that about half of the letters of Paul in the Bible are authentic, and about half are up for debate.
Wow.
There's kind of a sliding scale. A few of them are disputed, but for example, the pastoral epistles, which are, I remember them from the TI, it's 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus.
Not the rapper.
Are absolutely not. They're not Paul whatsoever. Christian scholars and non-Christian scholars, agree, and it's because they're way different. The writing style is way different. The portrayal of the character Timothy, for example, Timothy is the beloved boy who is his courier. He's his like trusted, youthful courier in Galatians and Romans and Corinthians, the Authentics. Whereas in First and Second Timothy, he's writing a letter to Timothy, basically calling him a piece of shit. And the reason I write about those letters in my book is because the pastorals are where we get women should be obedient and silent.
Oh, okay.
The pastorals are where we get slave masters, or slaves should be obedient to their masters. And it's just preposterous. It's later church fathers that are saying, yeah, Paul said this, Paul wrote this. And they even use, to come back to the earlier point, they even use words like, for example, deacon, which is not a word that was contemporary with Paul.
Yeah.
That's a later church word. And even words like piety, and I'm not sure savior, that's what made me think of it. But there's a couple of words that are like, we think are just synonymous with Christianity that are just, basically
later inventions.
3rd century.
Yeah. Control people. Yeah. Yeah.
Not authentic.
It's so dark. It's so dark and manipulative. And that to me is just like one of the underarching themes, though, like a lot of these ideas are different. A lot of these people are different. Again, I know we've said this already, but returning to the idea of using religion as a means to control people versus as a means to actually have a life-altering experience for yourself, like a life-altering
method.
Yeah. So, do you want to?
I have one. I have one more, Thomas. That's a nice segue into the cosmology stuff.
Let's do it,
because I want to let you riff on Valentinus and the cosmology stuff. This is Gospel of Thomas saying 22. Jesus saw infants being suckled. He said to his disciples, "These infants being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom." They said to him, "Shall we then as children enter the kingdom?" Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female one and the same, so that the male not be male, nor the female, when you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and a likeness in place of a likeness, then you'll enter the kingdom."
Beautiful, beautiful. You're getting right to what I was alluding to before with, I think that there's a direct quality of life difference depending on which metaphysical picture you put stock in, because this idea, the popular idea of creation, that like a God is completely outside of the creation and what's inside the creation is not God, and that you have to have, by virtue of that, you have to have faith in this idea of this completely external authority. Like this, for whatever reason that I can't really ascertain from reading any of the canonical texts themselves, like this idea is what the prevailing idea becomes, thanks to people like later, whether Aquinas or whoever, I don't remember who it was, but think about what that does to your psyche and what that does for sense making. It puts God not only far away, but unreachable. And that you should pray. Yes, you should believe, you should whatever, but it's also like, it's not literally anything that you have the capacity to realize or be with intimately, even though it's kind of contradictory because it's also a personal God. And I don't even know how you're supposed to square that circle. But if you look at the more Platonic, Hermetic, Gnostic way of viewing God, which is that it's literally in nature, its logic, its logos is all around you. The divine mind, you participate in the divine mind, particularly from as illustrated by that one fragment. Will you read that one again? The one about the one that I said sounds exactly like saying you already have this quality. Realize
if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Right.
And again, returning to Plato, what is within you is you have logos within you. You have this high faculty that is essentially akin to the divine mind. And if you use that high faculty to like see the sacred in the world, see the structure and the beauty in the world, you can participate in that and you can create. Like that's probably the highest quality is participation and create, like recognition and creation based on that quality. But if you don't bring that forth, what is in you will destroy you. Your appetite is also within you. And if you completely live your life according to your appetites, you'll ride that into the rocks until the day that you die, and your life will be this like meaningless quest for reproduction and like consumption and status and all of this shit. And that makes so much sense to me. And but the reason this is important metaphysically is that if you put more stock in, forget about the super complicated pictures painted by like people like Basilides or in this Apocryphon of John, which I know we didn't get into specifically, but where there's like all these like super complex hierarchies and stuff like that. If you simply take the idea seriously that there is this unspeakably perfect first cause, and it by its very nature emanates outward and creates in the same way that like the sun gives sustenance to the planet, and then from there it nourishes and brings forth all this other life, and it's interwoven with, and like I said, these things are descended from it, yet there is this distance, right? Like you're not directly connected to the thing. That distance implies all kinds of things about, you know, things coming in and out of being, like things becoming diverse and discrete, and therefore eventually being able to make decisions, make good decisions or bad decisions. And now, like within this very simplistic emanationist picture, you sort of get everything you need for basic sense making. Like, why is there a problem of evil? Well, because there's distinct beings that gain the ability to choose and do right or do wrong. And obviously that would be used as leverage to say, therefore, there is no God by a lot of people. But it's only a very specific kind of God that this strikes a blow to. It doesn't strike a blow to an emanationist picture of a God, or like this innate quality of like logos and sacredness in the cosmos. So to me, that's why I put so much stock in these metaphysical ideas. Like maybe not necessarily the metaphysical hierarchies, though I find them interesting, but just a simple picture of there being this like sneaky God outside of time that is like innate in everything at the same time, versus it starts to feel illogical, and like you just have to plug all of these holes in a sinking boat to make sense of that, versus the emanationist picture. It actually makes logical sense to me. Like it actually makes more logical sense than a rational materialist reductionist picture of the universe that's only here due to like very strange twists of fate. And I would even argue that emerging science is essentially proving that is what the cosmos is, but that's probably a conversation for another podcast.
Well, there's almost like three directions. If we're kind of zooming out on what you're saying, which I'm following, and I appreciate that summary there. I mean, I think you have kind of the monotheistic, God is out there, we do our best to try to please him, kind of institutional religion that's, kind of this way. And then you have kind of this, let's say the third way, which is like material secular, or kind of those are the two extremes, right? Monotheism and like atheism, like, no, there's no God. We're all just from the amino acid pool of, carbon merging with hydrogen and just smashing atoms all around randomly, and there's no point. And that's the secular material. That's such a reductive way to describe. There's some beauty in that too.
Yeah, maybe we're strong
secularists.
That's not the take you're getting on this channel, I guess.
Well, I can say, hey, Sagan says we are star stuff, and that's pretty poetic, even for the materialists. But that's one, but then this kind of mystic view in terms of what you're calling emanationist or Gnostic, or I think in many ways kind of Indian philosophy has a lot to do with this 100%. In terms of like, the infinite is, where else can it be but in your own consciousness? And our own ignorance of our infinite capacity is what sustains the finite. Yeah. Sometimes I say this is separation land. This is kind of mirror land. This is where everyone is at odds with each other because we're at odds with ourselves. There's this kind of psycho-emotional symbolic quality to when you self-transcend, there's this wake of support in terms of people around you, your community, the world, that are impacted by your own enlightenment and your own awakening. There's a kind of contagious quality to a lot of these masters that, that break the veil, that unplug, et cetera, that kind of can influence other people in a way. The more you explore the world mystic traditions, the ancient Gnostics, and to your point, a lot of the new science around consciousness and our understanding of consciousness as fundamental to this plane of reality, it all really opens up, and it all, I think the point that you're making is that there's a lot of practical impacts even to your own mental well-being to say, I don't have to be this knees on the pews, fearful. That's also reductivist,
right?
Monotheistic, and you also don't have to kind of be this nihilistic, right. Camus smoking the cigarette, rejectionist. There is this kind of beauty in the process of awakening and the process of connection, process of compassion that has a capital R reality to it all.
Right. Yeah. And just to even throw a little more substance behind the statement I made before about, I think science is revealing this. It will be the podcast that came out just before this one that I did with the neuroscientist Bobby Azarian, who's really interested in all different branches of science, but he's really interested in like complexity theory and essentially like an idea of a directed evolution, in that there is there's a clear teleology on display on every single level of reality, whether you're looking at like the micro scale on things like Pauli's exclusion principle on electrons, or you're looking at the formation of the early universe and fine tuning and the relationship between like the fundamental forces of physics having to be in these like super really close proportions to one another. It's like we are clearly through science showing time and time again that there is this structure, there is this teleology, there is this sort of goal directedness that despite things like the apparent entropy should be a cold hard fact. Like things should be careening toward absolute chaos and disillusion, yet we're getting more complex life forms, yet we're getting more interconnectivity, And it's like you can't dismiss that. Like it's clearly happening now. And which right, but which metaphysical picture that we've talked about today sounds like it could be part of an outgoing process. It's the emanationist picture, that there is this underlying logic and teleology and logos that is like encouraging life to exist. Like it's encouraging complexification and creation and diversity and creativity. That's the only picture to me that sounds like it fits in with that, which I find very, very interesting. It seems like we're getting like more sophisticated language to explain these things that mystics were somehow tapping into and figuring out on their own. And I got to tell you this. You mentioned the Stardust thing from Carl Sagan. You know who else says that? Timaeus, man. In the Timaeus, it literally says that we're made of stardust, and that blew my mind. That's one of those things. I've said this on the pod like 5 times now, probably, but that on its own is a really crazy thing to say 2,500 years ago.
That's amazing. You are a Platonist if there was a multiple choice scantron of your belief system.
Maybe. Maybe. But I really see, I also see myself as a perennialist. Like, I really want to get to the core of the wisdom behind all of these things. And I really start to like wriggle when I start to feel like people are being exclusionist or saying we have the exclusive, route towards salvation or truth or whatever. And that's what I like.
It's honestly preposterous to me too. Yeah. I mean, that really, I've said that before. My only enemy is exclusivity, and a lot of the more contemporary Hindu masters validated that. Yogananda, I dedicate my book to, who's a massive influence on me. Paramahansa Ramakrishna was essentially an interfaith or perennial. He was like a demonstrator in a sense, in that he was actually an ecstatic. He would go into samadhi all the time, like every day. He would fall into a blissful trance of divine union. But he later in his life, he kind of tried all religions. He was like Christian for a little bit, Muslim for a little bit. He tried a variety of different Hindu sects for a little bit, and he kind of validated them all. He's like, they're all authentic paths. And, kind of coming into, that was like middle 1800s. So it was like coming into this kind of globalized world. That's the message of the masters now, is to say, hey, stop bickering about the differences. One of his images is great. He's so simple. He was illiterate. He says, there's many ways to get on the roof. You can go up the ladder. You can go up the steps. You can climb the fence. You can climb a tree and jump. They're all different ways, but you end up on the roof of the house.
Totally. And maybe that's one of the, I agree. And I also think, something else is occurring to me now, but I don't know if I want to revisit this territory, because I think we went here during our last podcast too. But like, to me, there's a kind of exclusivity that I think is needed to really learn, because like there is education, right? And education by its nature is exclusive. Like you have to go through, you have to get the wisdom, you have to do the studying, you have to do the practices. And then, in some senses, I think it makes sense to exclude groups from higher kinds of wisdom because they haven't done the necessary work. But it shouldn't be exclusive in that, like, all these other groups are damned and like we're the group that exclusively is correct. Like that, there's some balancing point there that I think is needed. But
there is.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't want to just keep rambling. Sorry.
No, there's a Gospel of Thomas saying 28. He says, I took my place in the midst of the world, and I appeared to them in the flesh. I found all of them intoxicated. I found none of them thirsty. And my soul became afflicted for the sons of men, because they are blind in their hearts and do not have sight. For empty they came into the world, and empty too they seek to leave the world. But for the moment they are intoxicated. When they shake off their wine, they will repent.
Wow.
So I quote that one to essentially make a similar point that you're just making around kind of the spiritual path and the discipleship around, Jesus also says in the New Testament a lot, which Buddha says also verbatim, which is, he who hath ears to hear, let him hear. There's this kind of, that word initiation in the esoteric world of which you're so, entranced, like that word initiation can be off-putting and have at worst cult-like vibes. But I think on the positive side of that word and that intention and that concept is the idea that, that's what free will is. You can choose your level of kind of ignorance and stagnation and enjoy the 2 for Tuesdays at Buffalo Wild Wings and, check out the Vikings. And also there's maybe an avatar at Buffalo Wild Wings watching the game too. But
I think that sometimes,
the paradox of it.
Yeah. I think that kind of stuff sometimes too. Like definitely when like I'm passing someone on the street and they're they're like,
asshole.
no, I do that too, for sure. But I also think about I mean, this is in a lot of Greek myths too, right? That the gods would like take a kind of some kind of sorry form, and they would like punish the people who didn't help them, and like reward the people who did. I definitely think about that.
I just rewatched Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Oh yeah, I haven't seen that in a long time.
It's rewatch it, and that's what that term means. It's like that there's a master in the tea shop. That there's
That's cool. That's cool. I didn't know that. I don't know if we can go. We've gotten so broad now. I don't know if we can go back into the sort of like nuts and bolts.
Is that the joke of this episode? Is that we keep teasing the Apocryphon of John?
And well,
we don't
okay. Well, I guess let's wrap up, because I think with exploring that, and then let's wrap up. But I think paradoxically, all those points we made, I think you could argue that they sort of do pertain to the Gnostic outlook, but the Gnostic outlook itself is not immune to falling prey to all the same problems that we were talking about, because it can be very exclusive.
It can be elitist. Yeah, exactly.
And like, I mean, the Basilides, the one that I'm the most interested in, the one Jung was the most interested in, really was, I mean, that one criticism that you highlighted, that it is like, he claims it's for like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000. It's kind of true. I mean, it's kind of true, is that like not many people are going to have the eyes to see this truth, and they're going to just keep going on with their lives and take the easier path. But for those that want to see the deeper truth, like, you got to go this initiatory sort of esoteric hidden wisdom route. And paradoxically, I sort of agree that both ways are needed. Like, I think there is something to exclusive wisdom that's only for the initiated. Otherwise, it wouldn't be into all this esoteric shit, right? But at the same time, it can't be completely exclusive. And trying to find the balance in some of these ideas can be tricky. It can be really tricky, especially when you read something like Apocrypha of John, which is essentially like this secret gospel that turns everything upside down. And, like, suddenly the serpent in the Garden of Eden is, I don't remember in this version if it's Jesus or if it's Sophia, but it's like the agent of not evil, but the agent of salvation, like having Adam eat the apple and such. And
Christ told Adam to consume the fruit of the tree of knowledge.
Yes, right, and that's just one highly heretical idea.
That's only one moment of its heresy, and and then there's the Gospel of Judas, which wasn't in Nag Hammadi, but it's a Gnostic text that we got much more recently. Actually, it has a wild. It was in antiquities kind of marketplaces in the 70s and 80s. It was in like a safety deposit box, and it like got microwaved. It's kind of funny, like little sad story too. Scholars gasp. But Judas is the hero for turning Christ in, for quote unquote betraying him, because he allows him to fulfill the redemption mission. It's the Gnostics. What they do very well is flip all of the scene, and I feel I feel obligated to give this little summary on the way out here, which is, essentially the Apocryphon of John is the disciple of John stating his own grief and bewilderment after Christ's crucifixion. The Savior appears and then explains the narrative, which is that it's the monad.
Right, the one.
It starts with the monad, the one, the monarchy with nothing above it. Supreme, absolute, eternal, infinite, perfect, holy, self-sufficient, and cannot be prescribed, etc. Produces from that thought, the monad produces a feminine divine entity called the Barbelo.
Yeah, super interesting. This is like the transcendent hermaphroditic first being, basically.
Exactly. The first thought, the image of the monad. Always a she, but described as primordial mother and father, first man, Holy Spirit, Mother, Father, and in various terms of androgyny. She's the first class of the aeons, that term from earlier. And then other aeons come into being. Eventually, one of the aeons. Light is synonymous with Christ.
Yeah.
Is another kind of primordial simile. And then, Sophia is the wisdom, and she's kind of the character that engages in creativity without the participation of the spirit of the monad and without the aid of a male consort. So she also kind of self-impregnates Sophia herself, and that creative power of her thought produces the Yaldabaoth.
Yes, can't believe we got this far without saying that name.
Yeah, we got to the hour 40 mark in a Gnostic thing without saying Yaldabaoth. So he's the false creator god. He's also called the Demiurge. Yeah. Also at the end of the episode here. And yeah, he's grotesque. He is serpentine. He
head of a lion.
Sophia tries to hide him. And
say this with more vigor and intrigue, Bob.
Recognizing the deformed, imperfect nature of her offspring, Sophia attempts to conceal it where the other Aeons will not discover it. That's very kind of like Greek pantheon-y too.
It really is,
Eating. Who eats the kids?
Oh, Kronos.
Kronos, thank you.
Yeah.
Eating the children. And so Yaldabaoth creates a material world, and it just gets a little Lord of the Rings-ian with all these different Greek terms and new characters.
Yep, and then he makes the archons.
Faces.
Yep. He sort of mirrors the true divine hierarchy with the aeons, but he makes these archons basically, which are these false simulacra of these aeons, basically.
Yes. Recognizing an opportunity to retrieve the light imprisoned in the darkness of Yaldabaoth and his world, Sophia and agents of the higher order, referred to variously as the Planoria or the Epinoia, and later as the Pleroma, which is also kind of heaven, they trick Yaldabaoth into blowing his own spiritual essence into Adam. Seeing the luminosity, intelligence, and general superiority of the now animate Adam, Yaldabaoth and the archons regret their creation. There's a lot of regret in the cosmology.
Yep.
And then imprison him in this terrible false paradise called the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Where the fruit
that's
of the
the
trees
first,
is
the first Matrix. The first Matrix, right?
Death. Right. So Irenaeus was ticked off at all of this. And so, Christ is I think the biggest similarity between Christianity, Orthodox Christians and Gnostic Christians is Christ is still saving humanity. He reveals to John, he was the one who caused Adam to consume the fruit of the tree of knowledge, gnosis, knowledge being reparatory as opposed to descendant. It's a yin and yang about a lot of the early church theology. There's, I think, kind of wrapping up, like there's modern Gnostics,
right?
People on TikTok that call themselves Gnostic, and without being too egoic and judgmental.
Go hard on them, Bob. Come on.
Well, it's you. And see, the term New Age to most people, I think, including you, is pejorative.
Mostly,
and maybe I'm like just too naive, but like New Age has some positive elements to me because of its syncretic embrace of like world traditions. I think it has now, especially nowadays, it has like a cultural appropriation-y vibe, which is not cool. And I'm pro cultural recognition in my syncretism.
Yeah.
I'm citing the traditions as best I can that I'm borrowing from and appreciating in reverence in some capacity. But, there's some New Age Gnostics that I think probably one of the prerequisites to calling yourself a New Age Gnostic is like knowing who Valentinus was and, a couple of like pop quiz facts around like, if you don't know Marcion made the first canon, like, that would be some special knowledge, gnosis that might be useful in the Gnostic journey.
Yeah, right. And you're hitting the nail on the head of like what my overarching, again, very straw man issue is with New Age is that there seems to be this lack of understanding of where a lot of ideas come from, and also and elevating very dubious ideas to a level of long-standing mystical ideas, like they're somehow equal, and that always is very off-putting to me. But yeah, man, we
tend to be reductionist, like me. So I guess I have New Age qualities too. But
same, yeah.
But it's 100%. I think the good thing about it, is the openness and appreciation for, the unknown and the unfamiliar, and experimenting with what resonates and what doesn't, and yeah, I think just the Gnostics, I think in general, just to summarize, like they're really worth study. They're really worth contemplation. It's unfortunate to me that there is this dismissive quality within Christianity towards them, modern day Christianity. Oh, it's Gnostic. Oh, it's a heresy. It's like, well, then the control thing worked.
Right, exactly.
Because they wanted you to not read them. And now you can Google them, and we're still not reading them.
Right.
But it's really, it's worth understanding just how human the development of Christianity has been, and how open to interpretation I think the Jesus story, the Jesus message is across the millennia.
Such a fun one, man. I hope people enjoyed getting into the weeds on this, because I really did. Like, Bob and I are kind of we're kind of coming at it from different perspectives, I think, because you hit it on the head, man. I am way more into like the metaphysical, almost like mind altering nature of reading some of this stuff, and the syncretist aspect of it, like you are. And I think when we combine those two things, you sort of see why this stuff still remains important, even if you don't read it and think there's anything literally true in any of it, or if you do. Like, I think that's where you can square the circle. There is that there are both psycho-spiritual takeaways, and there is, I do think that what, like I said before, I'm interested in finding what I think is the sort of perennial philosophy that runs through everything. And I think you find it in Gnosticism in ways that you don't in mainstream religion. So it's fun for me. Thanks for doing it. Everybody go buy Bob's book. Anything else you want to say?
I have a really good, maybe there's another Thomas one that we didn't read that's really good. I have a final Gospel Thomas to take us out. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us how our end will be." Jesus said, "Have you discovered then the beginning, that you look for the end? For where the beginning is, there will the end be.
Ooh.
Blessed is he who will take his place in the beginning. He will know the end and will not experience death."
Wow.
Zen koans.
I got to read Gospel
up in
Thomas.
this.
Yeah.
So good. Thanks, brother.